So today I'm doing a quick video to talk about why I think the Panasonic S1H, even though it is 6 years old, is still the best mirrorless camera you can buy in terms of pure image quality. But it also has quite a few features packed into it that many other mirrorless cameras still don't have. We're gonna go through those features, talk about what makes this camera so special, and we're gonna do it right here at an amateur boxing competition called Toughman. So as you can tell, this is not my usual studio setup. I am on location filming an amateur boxing competition called Toughman, which is one of my favorite Appalachian traditions. I have filmed at this event quite a few times now and have featured it in 2 films. My feature documentary, which just launched on Roku last month, called Country Brawlers, and then also my narrative feature film directorial debut, which is called Beat Down and will be out soon. So make sure you stand by for that one. All right, let's get back to the S1H. So the Panasonic S1H was announced in June 2019, which means it's almost 6 years old, which is ancient in mirrorless camera terms. And yet it has some of the best features of any mirrorless camera, and in my opinion, the best 24p image quality you can get. So what makes this camera so special? Number one, it has a OLPF, and there is no other mirrorless camera on the market that features an OLPF. So what is an OLPF? Well, it is a filter that sits in front of the sensor and gives your image a almost softer and more cinematic look by filtering out some unwanted visual characteristics like aliasing and moire. Now, some cameras can deal with those pretty well, but having an OLPF makes the image that much nicer and is one of the reasons why this camera has an image quality that rivals, in my opinion, some of the higher end cinema cameras on the market. When I had this camera and was shooting quite a bit with it in 2020 and 2021, I would often shoot it alongside other mirrorless cameras like the Canon R5 or the Sony FX3. And every time I was amazed at just how much nicer the images looked coming out of the S1H. There was just no real comparison. And while Sony cameras and Canon cameras have gotten better since then, they still don't match the image quality coming out of the Panasonic when you're doing straight 24p in 4K. A great example of where an OLPF does an incredible job is the Ronin 4D 6K versus 8K. The 8K has the OLPF and the 6K doesn't. And you can see the difference in image quality between those two cameras. Yes, it's higher resolution with the 8K, but it is that OLPF that's really doing the heavy lifting. These filters are so important that Red used to sell 3 different types of OLPFs for their DSMC2 lineup. You could get one that prioritized skin tones, one that prioritized low light, or just a standard OLPF. Because of that OLPF, because of how deep and beautiful V-Log is and how much the color science matches some of those higher end cinema cameras, this camera can slot in as a B cam to an Arri Alexa or a higher end Canon camera or a Sony Venice, even Panasonic's own VariCam LT or EVA1. And I've seen this camera being used on smaller productions as that BCD cam because it is so easy to grade, has that OLPF, and has that highlight roll-off that is lacking in a lot of mirrorless cameras. In my opinion, a lot of mirrorless cameras, though very detailed, very sharp, and look great on YouTube, have a more digital and video-ish look than the Panasonic S1H. And I think the OLPF has a lot to do with that. This camera, in a lot of situations, feels like you're shooting a film, a movie, and that's why this camera is so beautiful. Hopefully, as Panasonic updates their lineup, especially their higher end lineup, and they go with an S1H2, they keep that OLPF in there because it is one of the biggest difference makers in the mirrorless world. This camera was also the first mirrorless camera to introduce open gate recording, meaning you can record the entire resolution of the sensor. For the S1H, that means a 3x2 6K sensor. And what's beautiful about this is it allows you to shoot with a 3x2 aspect ratio, which allows you to easily cut for 16:9 or for 9:16 if you're cutting for social media, for example. And though there are a couple cameras that have introduced open gate since the 2019 release of the S1H, the Fuji X-H2S comes to mind, most other full frame cameras do not have open gate. I still believe Panasonic is the only camera company that has put open gate in a lot of their cameras. But from the Canon R5 II, R5C, or even the higher end Sony cameras, none of them have open gate recording, and yet this 6-year-old camera does. pretty incredible. And one amazing thing about that 3:2 aspect ratio and open gate recording is the S1H then has incredible anamorphic support. So for a mirrorless camera, this camera can shoot 3:2, allowing you to de-squeeze 2x or 1.5x or 1.8x anamorphic lenses, and you can even visually see the anamorphic de-squeeze on your LCD screen, which some mirrorless cameras still don't let you do. So that makes the Panasonic S1H the best anamorphic mirrorless camera on the market. The S1H was also one of the first mirrorless cameras to have an incredible amount of codec options, including long op, all intra, ProRes RAW out, Blackmagic RAW out, and pretty much anything else you can think of is in this camera. This camera is also the very first mirrorless camera to ever be Netflix approved. Now, Netflix has historically had pretty stringent parameters on what cameras are allowed to shoot their original productions, and the S1H made that list based on a couple of factors. The first is that it can shoot 10-bit 422 all intra internally, which was a first of its kind and was not replicated for a few years for the other manufacturers to catch up, but also because it had timecode support through this little jack right here on top of the camera. And timecode is important because if you're working in a multicam environment or you're working with external audio, you can sync all those cameras and that audio later on. Still, to this day, there's only a few mirrorless cameras that have timecode support, and most of them are sort of in a janky way through the USB-C, like the Sony FX3. The Panasonic S1H has timecode, open gate recording, 6K RAW, tons of codec options, the OLPF in front of the sensor, and just incredible image quality. For all those reasons, it is one of the best cameras you can buy even today in 2025. But why hasn't it had the huge success that a lot of other cameras like the Sony FX3 have had? And there are a few reasons for that and some drawbacks, which never bothered me, but obviously bothered some users. Number one is the cropped 60 frames per second. So if you wanted to do slow motion in 4K, there was a 1.5 cropped into Super 35, so you couldn't get that full frame slow motion. At the time in 2019, that wasn't a big deal because there were very few cameras, if any, that could shoot 60 frames per second in 4K. But by the time 2022 rolled around, there were a plethora of options that could shoot 60 frames per second or even 120 frames per second in 4K with no crop. So big bummer that this camera can only do 60p in 4K with a crop on the sensor. The other one is, this is a pretty chunky camera. So even without the lens, you're looking at a camera that is almost over a kilogram, which is pretty heavy these days for a mirrorless camera. Again, at the time, it was so feature packed that it basically felt more like a small cinema camera, and still does today. But if you're thinking at it from a mirrorless user or a hybrid shooter, then there is definitely a drawback to having a camera this size. One other small drawback is the rolling shutter performance isn't incredible. It's not terrible, and I've never actually had a shot ruined by the Panasonic S1H, and I have rigged this to cars, especially as a car mount on the front of the hood of a car, and it moved around, and the rolling shutter was never an issue. But if you're doing a lot of whip pans, then maybe the rolling shutter could be a problem. And finally, the biggest one, and probably the biggest reason why Panasonic has not caught up to Sony and Canon and all the other big manufacturers, is autofocus. So this camera was a contrast detect only autofocus when it came out, which almost made it unusable for video applications. As someone who almost only shoots manually and often shoots with manual focus lenses, it was never a big deal for me, but obviously in the larger market, that hurt it quite a bit. So there we go, the Panasonic S1H, in my opinion, pound for pound, and it is hefty, it is the best mirrorless camera in terms of pure image quality you can get at 4K 24p. Yes, it has some shortcomings in terms of autofocus, in terms of slow motion, but it also has tons of other packed features like waveforms, like timecode, XLR module that goes on top that a lot of other camera manufacturers have never actually caught up with. And so the S1H still, in 2025, is still one of the best mirrorless cameras you can buy, and still my favorite to shoot with if I'm gonna go out and shoot with a mirrorless camera. So what do you think? Have you ever used the Panasonic S1H, and do you love the images coming out of it as much as I do? Let me know in the comments below what you would like to see in an S1H2, and hopefully Panasonic will listen. All right, thanks for watching, and I'm gonna go shoot some boxing, and we'll see you in the next video.